Welcome to ICSS, the Institute of Critical Study of Societies, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. We hold presentations on diverse subjects and topics at the Oakland, Nebel, and Proctor Marxist Library. We cover subjects such as capitalism, socialism, war, social justice, imperialism, and labor issues. With the start of the pandemic, we started meeting digitally on Zoom. This means that now our reach goes beyond Oakland, California, to all corners of the world where there is internet access. On our YouTube channel, we have 500 followers from around the world, and our presenters are now scattered from all across the globe. We strive to create an environment of mutual respect and a good discussion during our sessions. We try to make it comradely form, where ideas get presented for about an hour, then a debate or a Q&A takes place. We do not necessarily agree on all matters. The ideas and presentations expressed are the sole expressions of the presenter and the participants and do not necessarily represent the ideas and tendencies of ICSS or the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. However, we are united in respect to Karl Marx and his thoughts and the expansion of his thoughts for today. Our motto, taken from the 11th thesis on Feuerbach from Karl Marx, is, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point, however, is to change it." Today we have the presentation on the uprisings of the 1930s, but more than that, the response that these struggles have caused. Capitalism was in an upswing in 1920s. After the First World War, capitalism was again growing, but as we know, the system exists with ebb and flows, and the fall came in 1929. The most severe depression of capitalism came to the US with unprecedented horror. The full burden of the capitalist crisis was forced on the workers' shoulders. Unemployment, hunger, hopelessness spread over the land. People started to question the viability of the system. The depression became an existential threat for the system. Labor started to organize to protect the value of their labor, pitting sections of the working class against each other and using the crisis and the high unemployment. Capitalists forced workers to work for pittance. Capitalism was being rescued once again with the wage theft it was built on. To prevent the workers' unity and to protect the system that now faced a socialist country for the first time in human history that emerged after 1917, authorities made the Reds, the socialists, communists, and the labor organizers their one and only target. Any labor organizing effort or even the protection of gained rights was labeled as a communist effort to destroy the United States and its industry. The Oakland and San Francisco started a general strike in 1934. The longshoremen joined forces with workers all along the Pacific coast and Hawaii on May 9th, when the shipping companies, trying to take advantage of the crisis, refused to negotiate. The entire San Francisco and the Bay Area was shut down for 4 days. The entire labor unions and racial groups supported the strike, with some exceptions, small. The government and the corporations tried dividing the strike along the racial lines and red baiting. They painted the strike and the workers as agents of the Soviet Union on a mission to destroy the homeland. The newspapers signed formal agreements to support and protect the corporate interests. They reported that the area had been seized by foreign forces. The labor unions, on the other hand, didn't fall for the racial trap. At that time, most unions were white only, and Black or Asian labor were not allowed to join. Usually, the Black labor was used by the capitalists as strike breakers. In the struggle, the longshoremen agreed with the Black workers not to do strike breaking, and at the end of the strike, Blacks were allowed to join the union on July 31st, 1934. That's when the strike ended. In 1938 also, the approach to Asian workers changed. When the Chinese workers refused to load the ships supporting Japan's war against China, longshoremen joined forces and helped the Chinese workers strike. I think this is important for today's events when the Asians are under attack in the United States again. The response to these militant labor uprisings came as expected. We have John Holmes as our speaker today to remind us of these struggles in the 1930s and the reaction to the system. He's a history teacher at Merritt College in California. He's also on the executive council of the Peralta Federation of Teachers, representing the part-time workers. He was also involved as an activist in the typographical union. He identifies himself as currently preparing a biography of Noel London, a founding leader of the Jewish section of the American Communist Party and a victim of the Stalinist repression in the Soviet Union. That's his presentation of his book that's coming out. Welcome, John.
Hi, glad to see we've gotten up to 19 people. That's an improvement. Anyway, I think I'm going to be doing some sharing of the screen here. I'm actually going to. I hope people don't object too much to PowerPoints because I'm going to host disabled participant screen sharing. Please undisable me. Yes, I assumed I was abled because of the.
Raj, can you make him a co-host, please, so I can just he can do it. Go ahead, Raj.
While you're working on that, now. One thing I'll be saying is, Mehmet, I appreciate your remarks because you covered matters which I am not necessarily going to be covering here. So you supplemented the talk I'm going to give. And one thing I'm going to say is before I get into the labor rebellions, I'm going to talk a little bit about FDR and the New Deal, especially as that is so relevant to America right now. We are right in the middle of a artificial economic depression created by the lockdown because of the corona catastrophe. We have right now worldwide the most drastic economic downturn here since the 1930s. And liberals, and for that matter, avowed socialists like Bernie Sanders are talking about bringing back FDR liberalism and even about something called the Green New Deal. You can't understand the labor rebellions of the 30s without that context. I'm not going to get into the Great Depression itself. I actually have a separate lecture about the Great Depression and its causes, which perhaps at some future time I could give here if people like what they're going to hear. Yes, we have share screen now. I'm going to share screen as we speak. Share, yes. Okay, the New Deal and the Great Labor Revolt. And first, I'm actually going to start by, let's see. Let's see, I actually have to change screens here. I actually have to click on this. And that didn't, my screen sharing is paused. Oh dear. So, okay, so I should be able to, yes, there we go. Actually, no, we want to get to, okay. First, I'm going to say some things about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, especially with all the talk about bringing back the New Deal liberalism of the 1930s. Who was he? He was originally not a liberal Democrat. He was a moderate Democrat. To use the contemporary terminology, which really didn't come into vogue until the Roosevelt administration. In the 19th century, liberalism meant something very different than what it means nowadays. What he really was a progressive after the model of his brother-in-law, Teddy Roosevelt. As such, he believed in the government regulation of business according to the progressive model identified in the progressive era, more with Republican than with the Democratic Party. That he ended up in the Democratic Party instead of Republicans was somewhat accidental. His personal background is actually relevant here. I thought I had a slide about Roosevelt. Well, anyway, c'est la vie. His personal background is he came from a long line of rich Dutch landlords in upstate New York. They were the only landlords in America who at the time of the American Revolution, 1776, still had European-style feudal rights over their tenants. In the 1830s and 1840s, said tenants staged an armed rebellion against the rich Dutch landlords, which resulted in the abolition of the absolute final last vestiges of a feudal system in America. The New York Dutch landlords, like the Roosevelt family, and their Southern plantation counterparts were the closest thing in America to a European-style aristocracy. The Democratic Party evolved out of the work of Thomas Jefferson and later Andrew Jackson in the aftermath of the Revolution. The Democratic Party evolved as an alliance between Southern slave masters, Western pioneer farmers, and Northern urban white workers versus Northern merchants and factory owners, America's first genuine capitalists. Their party, the Republican Party, is their party, which evolves out of the original Federalists of Hamilton and Washington by way of something called the Whigs. But in any case, that's the ancestry of the Republican and Democratic parties, which everyone needs to understand what's going on in America in the year 2021. Okay? In a certain sense, that tradition created by Jefferson and continued by Jackson of an alliance between the slave masters and the workers and farmers against the Northern capitalists was continued by FDR. FDR was an old money aristocrat, hated by Republican big businessmen, successors of the robber barons whose wealth accumulated in the Gilded Age. The main thing about him, the main thing to understand about Roosevelt, was he was a brilliant politician who saw politics as much more important than political principles. Okay? So in the middle of the Great Depression, he was willing to completely ignore longstanding foundations of the American political system whenever it seemed necessary. And a lot of businesses didn't like it, but as Roosevelt famously responded to them, to the businessmen who were calling him a socialist, "I'm the man who saved capitalism in America," which seemed to many people to be seriously in question during the 1930s. Especially at Roosevelt's inauguration, which had come, Roosevelt became president right after the so-called bonus march, in which World War I veterans who had not received the bonuses that had been promised to them by the US government after World War I marched on Washington and were met by the US Army, led by Douglas MacArthur, such as it was, who shot at medal-bearing US veterans congregated requesting that the American government do something for them, which the American government refused to do. When Roosevelt heard about this event, his response was, "This means I'm going to be elected president," and he was right. Okay, Roosevelt had great force of will. For public lectures, he managed to stand at podiums by gripping the sides with his hands, despite the polio that confined him to wheelchairs. The American public did not know this, as the press, which was somewhat more obedient to politicians than it is nowadays, quietly helped him keep the secret. So, in his inaugural address, he gave his immediate response to the Great Depression, in which he famously stated that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and called on Congress to grant him broad executive powers to deal with the crisis, which it did. A frightened Congress gave him absolutely everything he wanted. This is in the middle of a nationwide run on the banks when it looked like the whole American banking system was going to collapse. Just as briefly it looked like in 2008 and 2009, when it looked like the whole American banking system was about to collapse at one point. So he declared a nation with innumerable Americans losing their life savings as banks declared bankruptcy. He declared a nationwide bank holiday. When it was over, so were the runs on the banks that were going on. And instead of lining up to take money out of the banks, people were lining up to put their money right back in. And then he passed a deposit insurance law for the very first time in all American history, guaranteeing consumer savings accounts up to $2,500, which back then was a whole lot of money. The bank panics were now over, and Americans were putting their faith in Roosevelt as their only savior. Dictatorship as a solution to catastrophe was in the air in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression. Germany had Hitler, Italy had Mussolini, The Soviet Union had Stalin, and it seemed America had the American equivalent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Donald Trump tried to play the same role during the last, this Rooseveltian Mussolini role during the last year, not too successful. Okay, so let's talk about, and his second measure was immediate cash relief. On his first day in office, he set up a table outside the White House and personally handed out $20 bills without even asking for congressional approval to the poor who lined up to the table on the White House lawn. Things were a little different then. You didn't have fences around the White House. Okay. Conservatives accused him of being communist because federal government relief for the poor was against all American tradition. Probably best expressed by a former Democratic president, Grover Cleveland, during the Great Depression of the 1890s, when he said it was the duty of the American people to help the American government, not the duty of the American government to help the American people. That was the traditional attitude of both parties, most certainly including the Democratic Party. Okay, and then you start having the social measures of the New Deal. And they were prepared for, by the way, in the 1920s. Because in the 1920s, after the great labor upsurge after World War I, with percentage-wise, I think, the most people on strike in all American history, with the possible exception of the period after World War II, to some degree inspired by the belief that of Americans that you had this war for democracy, right? You had the belief by Americans you'd had a war for democracy, and there was talk about economic democracy as that at home. So when the workers got home, that combined with the impact of the Russian Revolution on the American labor movement, which even led to a workers' council, a Soviet in Seattle, you had a huge labor upsurge. Unfortunately, it was defeated and was replaced by the company unions of the 1920s, which were company-run unions, which were not unions in the modern sense. Workers didn't get to vote, and they certainly would never carry on strike, but they would have various social measures for the membership so as to get workers to no longer be interested in unionism, such as health insurance, old age pensions, and unemployment insurance, all run by the companies through company unions, a new thing in American history, which laid the groundwork for workers' expectations of government assistance when companies canceled them all during the Great Depression, just exactly when they were most needed. So you had a general feeling that desperate measures were needed, and all Roosevelt proposed legislation in the year 1933 was immediately rubber stamped by Congress without argument. He became the nation's therapist for the Great Depression. The Great Depression was extremely depressing, and people needed a therapist. And so Roosevelt had his weekly nighttime fireside chats. The first making use of the radio, which was the 1930s equivalent of social media and Twitter. Making use of the radio, he was, for the first time ever in American history, in American prison, communicating with the American people on a regular basis, reassuring them and telling them that the government would save them. Donald Trump's Twitter purposes were a modern equivalent, serving different purposes rather less successfully. So for the first time in American history ever, the president could be seen as somebody people could turn to in times of distress. So now we get to the first New Deal, having escaped the missing slide. Now, I'm not going to go over all the New Deal legislation. This is not that kind of lecture. I'm just going to discuss some critical highlights and the difference between the first New Deal of his first term and the second New Deal of his second term. That straight dollar relief I talked about was a brief experience, quickly replaced by grants and loans to states for work relief programs at the local level. Later, during the second New Deal, this will be federalized. There will be the alphabet soup of government bodies, WPA, CCC, so on and so forth, employing the unemployed on work relief projects building infrastructure of various kinds. This was loosely talked about after 2008, but not done, and now is once again being loosely talked about both by Trump and now by Biden, and not being done. We'll see if it gets done this time. But in any case, and that's mostly due to the fact that the American infrastructure is in a state of complete collapse, as we all know. As anyone knows, here in the Bay Area, through our occasional electrical power failures, not to mention, I could go on and on about that, but we should all be aware of the complete collapse of the American industrial infrastructure. And okay, so basically, and the peak of the New Deal, by the way, as many as 1/3 of all working Americans were working for the government under the economic philosophy called Keynesianism, after Lord Keynes. And FDR was definitely a Keynesian, and so was every American president up through and including Richard Nixon. Okay, now Keynesianism is being revived a little bit, despite its failures over the last half century. But anyway, so what is, so we'll get to that in a minute, but first let's talk about the progressive policies of the first New Deal. The main component of the first New Deal was the National Recovery Act, or the NRA. This was progressivism of his cousin Teddy Roosevelt taken to its logical conclusion. Under the National Recovery Act, all business in America was to be subject to regulation by government codes, adopted through public hearings and negotiations with businessmen. Labor representatives were included in the hearings. The administration looked favorably on unionization, actually, in theory at least. The fundamental idea was to eliminate overproduction. Nowadays, overproduction is considered to be the Marxist explanation for economic crises. In my depression lecture, I go into that. Back in the 1930s, this was not a Marxist conception. Everyone knew that overproduction of the 1920s was all about the Great Depression. This was simply an accepted fact, not controversial. Okay, so the idea of the National Recovery Act was to eliminate overproduction by reducing production. So the attempt to, under the NRA, to plan production on a free market capitalist basis did not work, to cut a long story short. Finally, it was thrown out by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. But we have a remnant of the NRA of the system in agriculture to this day. Farmers are paid not to grow certain crops to prevent overproduction. What this means in practice is the subsidization of corn, rice, and wheat instead of fruits and vegetables, playing a major role in the American obesity and diabetes epidemics, which now have spread worldwide. So as for what the NRA did for the American economy by limiting production, it simply became an obstacle to recovery from the Great Depression. It was a total failure. Okay, leading to the, that was 1933, that leading to the crisis of 1934. In the year 1934, you had a very slow economic recovery, and the slowness was widely blamed on the clumsy measures of the NRA and the inadequacies of scattered local work relief programs administered by various states with funding from the federal government. So radical movements developed in America, especially in that year, by which time Roosevelt's first New Deal was broadly seen as being inadequate and ineffective. The most popular of these movements was Louisiana Governor Huey Long's Share the Wealth program. He proposed redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor, not through tax policy. And by the way, something people talking about progressive income taxes and taxing the rich, something that not a lot of people realize is that the federal income tax, when introduced in the year 1912, was a tax on the rich and only a tax on the rich. Until World War II, all income tax, federal income tax in America applied only to rich people and never to the poor or to working people. Okay. Roosevelt, during World War II, initiated the modern idea of taxing everyone, until World War II, there were no deductions from payroll. You know, if you were rich, you figured your tax at the end of the year, and sometimes you paid it, and sometimes you didn't. Okay, but the federal income tax until World War II applied strictly and only to the rich. Okay, so anyway, so Huey Long wanted something much more radical than taxing the rich. He wanted to simply take the money from the rich and give it to the poor, period. Which was obviously unconstitutional, but in the 1930s, nobody really cared about that when you get right down to it. Okay, at least at the height of the Great Depression. It gained great popularity with nobody except the lawyers, the judges, and the quite unpopular Hoover Republicans worried about how unconstitutional, un-American it might happen to be. Huey Long was planning to run against Roosevelt in the 1936 Democratic primaries, and many people thought he was going to win. However, he got assassinated, which put an end to that. There were many other radical movements popping up. I also want to talk a little bit about the one here in California. Here in California, we had Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. He ran on the socialist ticket for governor in California several times in the 1920s and did extremely poorly because most California socialists had joined the Communist Party. In 1934, he finally gave up on the enfeebled California Socialist Party, and unlike Bernie Sanders, managed to win a Democratic Party nomination for governor of California. His platform was called EPIC, which stands for End Poverty in California. It included a watered-down version of the socialist idea of production for use. So Upton Sinclair proposed that California should take over farms and businesses that had gone bankrupt, reopening them as state-supported production cooperatives. Exactly how this was going to be paid for was never quite clear. Well, he did talk about taxes, upping taxes on the rich. But anyway, FDR and the Democratic Party thought he was too radical, and the Democratic Party nationally gave him no backing whatsoever. And you had a huge media campaign funded by California business to expose his allegedly radical background, which included friendly statements about the Soviet Union, included all sorts of weirdo alternative medicine stuff. But in any case, this was the first such large-scale media campaign in American history ever, taking the forms of whenever you went to the movies, which was popular during the 1930s, you'd have a newsreel in front of it, sponsored by Hollywood. And the main purpose of the newsreel was to explain to everyone attending the movies that if Upton Sinclair was elected, California would be flooded with Okies and hobos seeking welfare benefits, and communists would infiltrate the government. In fact, the communists and the socialist parties both opposed his candidacy. He was defeated, but his campaign revitalized the very weak California Democratic Party. During the 1920s, the Democratic Party in California, the Republican Party was possibly stronger in California than anywhere else in America. And what was left of the Democratic Party was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, as in the Democratic mayor of LA, who was a Klansman. There was also a Klan Democrat in Oakland, I believe, for a while as well. So Upton Sinclair began the transformation of the California Democratic Party from a Ku Klux Klan party to the more liberal party and the more leftist wing of the Democratic Party was now. And the CIO involvement of the Democratic Party and the Communist Party had a strong influence in that. In 1938, the most radical governor in California history, Colbert Olson, was elected through a lot of doorbelling by the CIO, then run by Harry Bridges, closely associated with the Communist Party. And Colbert Olson's vice lieutenant governor is believed by many historians to be a closet member of the Communist Party. Whether he is or not, it's hard to say, but he's certainly quite close to it. And so you had the most left-wing administration in California history, which unfortunately is mostly famous for putting Japanese into concentration camps. It accomplishes essentially nothing else. Anyway, back to 1934. Okay, the most dramatic outbursts of radicalism in the year 1934 were in industry. It was a peak year for labor militancy. At first, the NRA was seen by some labor leaders as a charter for the rebirth of unionism. Mine Workers President John L. Lewis managed to rebuild his battered United Mine Workers Union using the slogan that the president wants you to join the union, to join a union. But at first, in 1933 and into 1934, most unions continued to be defeated on the picket lines as desperate unemployed workers were mobilized to scab. Unions were invited to participate in NRA planning, but that didn't mean any practical support for unionization. It simply meant that union leaders got to sit on the board. Quickly, unionists started calling the NRA the national runaround for labor. But 1934 was the year that the passivity among the poor of the first years of the Great Depression came to a dramatic end. Labor militancy truly exploded. You had 3 general strikes in 3 different American cities: San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo. All of them were led by radicals and communists of one stripe or another. In Toledo, Ohio, which was the unemployment capital of America, the city in America with the very highest unemployment rate, pardon me, the Toledo Auto Light Company thought it would be easy to defeat a strike in the auto industry. They were wrong, as there was a radical organization, the American Workers' Party, had organized the unemployed very effectively into an unemployed league. It participated fully in the strike, which at one point essentially turned into a citywide general strike. It forced both union recognition, the first ever in the auto industry, and the hiring of a large number of unemployed workers at the Toledo Auto Light plant. The group thereafter joined forces with the communist dissidents, supporters of Trotsky, not Stalin, who led the Minneapolis Teamster strike and a brief citywide general strike. Minneapolis was converted from what had previously been one of the biggest bastions in all the Midwest of anti-union conservatism into the pretty liberal town it is nowadays, as recent events of the last year have demonstrated. The people of Minneapolis have made pretty clear that by and large, they don't care for racist police brutality, I do believe. The Teamsters Union, which started as a small craft union of wagon team drivers of the horse and buggy days, would become the strongest and most powerful union in America because of the heritage of the Minneapolis General Strike. Famous Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa learned his trade union tactics, though not his political beliefs, from the Trotskyist leaders of the Minneapolis Teamsters Union in the 1930s, such as Farrell Dobbs, who later went on to be the chairman of the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party in the 1950s. In which, well, I don't know. Well, let's not get into that. And then, of course, you had the biggest of the general strikes, the San Francisco General Strike. I've got a picture here of strikers surging up Market Street. Okay, he was a longshore union activist closely linked to the official pro-Stalin American Communist Party. It's a dispute among the historians studying the Moscow archives whether he was actually a member or not of the Communist Party. My personal opinion is that since by all indications he was not paying dues, he was not a member. And he was certainly not under the Communist Party discipline. As Harry Bridges himself once put it, the communists don't tell me what to do, I tell them what to do, which I think was pretty accurate. Okay, so yeah, he may have been a member of the Politburo of the American Communist Party, but he wasn't a member of the Communist Party. Now, whether Lenin would have approved of such an arrangement is besides the point. That's the way it was. Okay, so anyway, this was the most successful labor rebellion in America during the Great Depression. It was part of a coastwide longshore and seaman strike extending even into Canada. Out of it came the communist-influenced longshore union, the International Longshore and Warehouses Unions, which became the backbone of the West Coast labor movement, which it pretty much still is to this day. It is no longer linked to a party which barely exists anymore, but is still clearly the most leftish major union in America. It is widely known for its one-day strikes for political causes, such as against apartheid in South Africa, against the war in Iraq, and lately against police brutality. Last May, in the context of calls from various sides for labor action against the corona catastrophe, there's a one-day dock shutdown in Oakland on May 1st against police brutality, and in protest against the way the coronavirus catastrophe has been mishandled by governments and employers. I had the privilege of speaking at this rally, and later I'll put up the link for the YouTube video done of that rally, where I come down speaking in around about the 15-minute mark. It'll be easy to see me because I'm festooned with so much PPE that I look like a space alien. But anyway, I'll put that up in the chat. I'll put that link up in the chat later for anyone who wants to watch it. And okay, so that's the let's get to the second New Deal. Under the impact of the radical outbursts of 1934, both in politics and industrial warfare, brilliant politician Roosevelt moved with the times. It was the popularity of Sinclair's EPIC program in California that persuaded him it was politically safe to create large-scale government-run federal work relief programs, such as the Workers' Progress Administration, or the WPA, and start to legislate other key elements of the Second New Deal in 1935. So by the 1936 election year, you had the abandonment of the progressive NRA, which the Supreme Court had ruled unconstitutional and was widely seen as a failure in any case, for the liberal, not progressive, but liberal Second New Deal. FDR moved from progressivism to liberalism, which is how he now describes his political credo. In the 1936 election, he said that he was the liberal candidate, as opposed to conservatism of the Republican opposition. Indeed, the second FDR administration represents essentially the birth of the contemporary concept of liberalism in America. It is quite different, as I said before, from the liberalism of the 19th century. The term really first hit American politics during Reconstruction, when you had the liberal Republicanism of the moderate wing of the Republican Party was counterposed to the radical republicanism of politicians like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Okay, this is also the time in which radicalism, like liberalism, first entered American political discourse. The radical Republicans wanted to finish the Second American Revolution, which some people call the Civil War, and establish a real basis for Black equality in America, which the liberal Republicans did not want to do. And of course, they were opposed to the Democratic Party, which was calling itself the Conservative Party at the time. So that's how liberalism, radicalism, conservatism became the tropes of American political discourse during the aftermath of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Okay, and the 1936 election is where the modern polarization between liberals and conservatives in American politics was born. So what was the Second New Deal? The three key pillars of the Second New Deal were, number one, the Social Security Act, establishing Social Security payments, the retirees and the blind, unemployment insurance, and welfare. The foundation stone of the American welfare state, or at least of such of it that has not been abolished yet. By the way, the way that Social Security was constructed meant during the 1930s that was very much a losing deal for workers, because they were paying into something they were paying payments they could not afford into something that they would only get a benefit from after they retired. It was only during and after World War II that Social Security could be considered truly beneficial, and communist, socialists, radicals, and unionists were often very dubious about the Social Security Act. But less so about unemployment insurance and welfare, of course, was another story. And of course, as you know, welfare was as we know was abolished by Democratic President Clinton. But some bits and pieces of the welfare state, which have been gravely weakened in the last 30 years or so, are being brought back by Biden, expanding a bit through his stimulus bill, expanding a bit on the Trump stimulus from last year, which is also doing some of that. That's number one. Number two was the 1935 Wagner Act, which was called Labor's Magna Carta by union officials, establishing the National Labor Relations Board. It supervises union representation elections at companies and can punish what it sees as unfair labor practices. For the first time in American history, companies became legally compelled to negotiate with their unions. Unions at least duly certified by the NLRB as the representatives of their employees. That seemed to be a great breakthrough at the time, but nowadays it's better seen as a way of government control over union action. Because unfavorable labor practices now are used as much against unions as against companies. And essentially, you can't go on strike until at least you've gone through the ritual of an NLRB election. And so you have the stuff that's going on with Amazon right now, where you have a union election, which Amazon is crawling all over. But it was certainly better than the previous legal situation under which unions were questionably legal in the first place. And lastly, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the last major New Deal measure. It enacted a maximum 40-hour work week and a minimum wage for the first time in US history. Now, the maximum work week is to some degree a dead letter by now, but minimum wage laws are alive and well. They've been expanded lately in many states and cities, not least in California and the San Francisco Bay Area, as we all know. And this came about not through legislative action, but through rallies, pressure, and a movement for raising the minimum wage. And as we all know, so this led Biden to claim that he was for raising the minimum wage, fully well knowing in advance, as Biden was a great measure of Congress, that it would never pass through Congress. So therefore, it was safe for Biden to call for an increase in the minimum wage, since he knew it wouldn't happen. But it would be a great thing to use for the Democrats against the Republicans in 2022. Okay. Now, one thing that has to be understood is that the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act was in 1938. It was a direct result of what happened in 1937 after Roosevelt's reelection, which I'm going to get to for a moment. The great labor upheaval of the late 1930s. And actually, first I should go back. Wait a minute, hold on. Oh dear. One thing that has to be understood is that after Roosevelt was elected in 1936, he thought that all these measures he had passed would cure the Depression. So he immediately started cutting the budget to, prevent the U.S. government from going broke, right? And as a result of which, America headed right back into the Great Depression. The budget cuts, Roosevelt's budget cuts reversed the recovery. And as late as the year 1940, the unemployment rate in America was 15%, which is higher than it is right now. Okay, many people believe that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. It benefited a lot of workers, but it did not end the Great Depression. It was World War II, which ended the Great Depression, which is the ultimate example of military Keynesianism. Okay, now, so what made the 1937 possible was the birth of the Congress of Industrial Unions, the CIO, led by Coal Miners Union President John L. Lewis, the man who had rebuilt his battered mine workers union by saying that the president wants you to join a union and leading strikes. His union and several others within the old AFL were already organized on an industrial basis, notably the garment worker unions, which traditionally had been led by socialists. And so they sought to organize new industrial unions in the heart of American mass production, especially in the auto industry. And the auto industry in the 1930s was the heart of American industry. It was the central industry of the automobile age of the 1920s, 1930s. 10 such unions were suspended by the AFL in 1936 and 1938. So the founding convention of the CIO as a rival federation. What made that possible was the CIO-centered upheaval of 1937, whose weapon was the sit-down strike. The tactic of the sit-down strike was originally pioneered in Europe. I believe in Poland was the first place it was used during the Great Depression, and even earlier in America by the IWW. It was perfectly suited to the Great Depression conditions. instead of picketing outside a plant and having to battle to prevent desperate unemployed scabs mobilized by companies from crossing picket lines, workers took over factories, stopping production immediately and altogether. And if I have a video, which I'm hoping we'll have time to show, it's only a half hour long, about the Flint sit-down strike. We'll hopefully we'll have time to play that, or at least part of that this morning. And the video gives the story of the Flint sit-down strike, which pioneered an explosion of CIO-led sit-down strike throughout American industry. Now, one thing that is, it tells the story extremely well of Flint and what came out of Flint, but it leaves out one important aspect, namely the role of leftists in the sit-down strikes. The leaders of the strike, the Reuther brothers, Walter Reuther and Victor Reuther, were socialists, members of the Socialist Party, who in the past had been highly sympathetic to the Soviet Union, if not to the American Communist Party. They were auto workers who spent several years working in auto plants in the Soviet Union before returning to America to become labor organizers. Their letters sent home from the USSR expressed enthusiasm for socialist construction and what they saw as, quote, from one of Victor Reuther's letters, genuine proletarian democracy in the exceedingly Stalinist Soviet Union. By the way, at the height of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, 100,000 American workers applied for entry visas into the Soviet Union, where they figured that given the Soviet Industrial Revolution, they could get jobs. Fortunately for them, probably, few of them were accepted, but the Reuther brothers were among them. Later, whether for reason of political conviction or simply political wisdom, he would become a leading opponent of communism in the American labor movement. In his first few years, the United Auto Workers Union was strongly influenced by the Communist Party, and some of its leaders, but not the Reuther brothers, were very close to it or members of it. And the women's auxiliary of the union at Flint, whose exciting adventures are very well described in the video, was led by Genora Johnson, who was a socialist during the strike, but who joined the Trotskyist communist organization after the strike. And the leaders of the strike were communists, socialists, Trotskyists, as was usual and inevitable for labor rebellions during the 1930s. Now, the Communist Party was very, very radical in the early 1930s. In 1933, it organized the largest farm workers strike in American history, in which its revolutionary program was unconcealed. Farm worker strikers carried red flags, sang red songs, and the leadership of the 1933 California cotton workers strike, which was the largest farm worker strike in the entire history of the United States of America, was communist-led. This strike was used by John Steinbeck as the basis for his first famous novel, Indubious Battle. Now, recently, at long last, there's been a movie made about Indubious Battle, although unfortunately, it's only on YouTube, despite its remarkably star-studded cast. The regular movie theaters refuse to distribute it. However, there's a very fine trailer for it, which is only 2 minutes, which I'd like to play right now, which definitely gives you the right idea. Okay, we can see that, and
not yet.
Okay, can everyone hear this? See this?
No, we are not seeing it. We still have your the presentation. If you
okay,
can,
so I'll have to let me stop that, go back to the beginning, and we'll have to, let's see, how do we handle this? I think I have to unshare and then reshare.
Unshare and then reshare the new window.
Right, let's do that. Let's do that. Why am I
Stop share.
I'm not getting to the.
Click the stop share first.
Yeah, my problem is I get to something called meeting controls, which doesn't give me much. Oh, hold on. Oh, here we are. Up here, we have here pause share, new share. That should work, right?
Yeah. Or
okay.
Stop sharing the first one first.
I don't have, for some reason, I don't have a stop share option. I do have a new share option. Mute, stop video, security, participants, new share. Oh, more. Let's see under more. Pause recording, stop recording, da da da.
I'm going to stop your sharing. I've stopped your sharing. Go ahead and share.
Thank you. Okay, now that the sharing has been stopped, let me check the chat while I'm at it. Okay. Very good stuff on the chat. Okay, so now I will share again. Share. Do people see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, away we go.
This price cut pains me as much as it pains you.
Oh, hey, you must be the new recruit. Got a good time. Tomorrow morning, I'm heading to the Tortoise Valley. You're coming with me. What's in Tortoise? Apples. Boomers come out for the season to pick them.
I can't live on dollars then. You know what you're getting into?
Poor bastards spend their every last dime getting out there. As soon as they're there, bosses slash the wages.
Either whine or go to work.
That's where you and me come in. And fix that job real quick. I'm a chance to buy for something.
Well, you better have some food.
My old man worked these fields. He had the nerve to stand up and say they weren't treating him right. For that, they shot him like a dog. So who are we? We're the guys who are going to change all that. We're trying to change things for millions of people.
Know that I will crush this strike and bury each and every one of them. It's on us, man. This is on us.
All mine is just a simple, clean life.
Any resistance will be met with swift and permanent force.
That's the cost of all of this. It ain't right.
Start this out. Our country will know about it. Of course.
Now who's with me? The time for waiting is done.
Man that he's met me, he's defeated every obstacle, every enemy but one. He just can't win against himself.
You want it in?
Moving, Mommy.
This is the job.
You feel the tension.
Come on now, get out of our camp.
I met Mac McLeod in 1933. I witnessed it up close. Trying to see real change. It's not about you and me. It's about Lisa's kid and what kind of world he's going to grow up in.
Maybe okay, yeah. If you want to reshare, there you go. We
Stop
have
the music. Hang on a second.
If you want to stop your other window video.
okay.
We don't need that. No, we don't.
No, music came back.
You close the window.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Are we?
Yeah, we
We're
have the
okay.
screen with the presentation.
We're back with the presentation. Good. And okay. So, despite its famous director and star-studded cast, the movie moguls refuse to distribute it. I will, however, you can get it on Netflix, and at some point I'll put up the link for that, which you've just seen up in the chat. I highly recommend it, and I highly recommend the book. However, there are problems with it, namely that in Steinbeck's version, it's presented as being mostly an Okie event, whereas in fact, the great majority of the strikers were Latinos and Filipinos. And even the hero, played by Nat Wolff in this, all the major characters are based on actual people and strike leaders. And although the movie is slightly less explicit, but only slightly less explicit about the ties between this movement and the Communist Party. But the main hero in the movie, played by Nat Wolff, is based on a real individual, and that real individual was in fact a young Jewish woman at the age of 20, whose personality is in fact very much like the individual, like the hero of the movie. But enough on the movie, which nonetheless I highly recommend, as well as the book. But that was the going back a little bit. That was the Communist Party in the early 1930s. Okay. By the late 1930s, the party had gone through a political transformation. The victory of Nazism in Germany persuaded Soviet leader Stalin that rather for calling for a revolution in the West, so there should be no more waving of red flags and more or less communist slogans from strike leaders, and no more, for example, the position of the Communist Party in the early 1930s was quite simply that FDR was a Mussolini fascist, which, by the way, may sound insane now, but technically has a certain validity, as there's a strong parallelism between the economic policies of the NRA and the corporatism of Mussolini and to some degree Hitler. In a formal sense, there was quite a bit of similarity between FDR's first administration National Recovery Act policies,
come on, where are you?
and those of FDR, purely formally.
I want that.
But okay, so the Communist Party went through a transformation and was now trying to form what were called popular fronts of all people of goodwill against Hitler and Germany. The American Communist Party, following Stalin's orders, went from calling Roosevelt a fascist to supporting Roosevelt backhandedly somewhat in the 1936 elections. By then, Roosevelt, as we've seen, had taken a bit of a step to the left. Communist Party leader Earl Browder liked to proclaim that communism is 20th century Americanism. What some historians like to call popular front culture, like the folk music of Communist Party sympathizer and possibly member, I don't really know, Woody Guthrie, was fairly influential in the 1930s. The now renovated all-American Communist Party suddenly became a lot more popular with recruiting rapidly. And you have the movie based on Steinbeck's second famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which is, among other things, an absolutely fine example of popular front culture. If we have time, I'll play a clip from that as well. Grapes of Wrath tells the story of the so-called Okies, the white farm population of Oklahoma and surrounding states, driven out of their farm by the Dust Bowl and by the mechanization of agriculture, funded by New Deal agricultural programs, which, by the way, the movie, like the book, does a good job of displaying exactly how the agricultural programs of the New Deal led to the Okies being driven off the land. With farmers paid not to grow crops, sharecroppers and tenants, white or black, get evicted in great numbers as small farmers unable to pay for tractors go broke, as they just can't compete with the big landowners. In the aftermath of the breaking of the communist-led Farm Workers Union in California in the middle 1930s, with all of its leaders in jail and mass deportation of the Mexican immigrants who were most of its rank and file, Okies briefly replaced the immigrants in California's factories in the fields, but were not treated any better by farm owners whose dominion over the California countryside got compared by liberals and leftists to European fascism, for reasons that get pretty clear if you watch either of the two movies based on Steinbeck's novels or read the book. Okay. In the great labor upsurge of the 1930s, the Communist Party not only acquired considerable influence in the American labor movement, but sympathy from liberals like Steinbeck, and some in government as well. For a while, the executive secretary of Roosevelt's National Labor Relations Board was an avowed sympathizer and perhaps even a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party also had considerable popularity with minority communities as America's only truly anti-racist white organization during the 1930s. This is especially true among black people after the communist role in the defense campaign for the Scottsboro Boys. This was not always the case with its liberal allies. In the Scottsboro trial, the communists were the boys' most consistent defenders, with even NAACP lawyers trying to make compromises with racist authorities. When most of them actually got off, the party's credibility in the black community went up and the NAACPs went down. Some people are possibly familiar with the book Hammer and Hoe about the Communist Party in Alabama in the 1930s, which helped organize workers, notably in the steel industry, like in a little town called Bessemer, which is the heart of the steel industry in the South, where nowadays Amazon workers have been inspired by that for a unionization drive, which has a lot to do with the heritage of the civil rights movement, of the Black Lives Matter movement, stretching all the way back to the role of communists in organizing black workers in the 1930s in Alabama, and especially in the steel industry. Okay. So, and by the way, John Steinbeck portrayed the strike narrated back to Indubious Battle as an all-white strike, which is exactly what it was not. And this was partially remedied in the movie, one of whose stars is Selena Gomez. And this is even more true for the party's occasional semi-ally, the Roosevelt administration. The original book version of Grapes of Wrath, unlike the Hollywood version, does not ignore non-white farm workers altogether, but it's definitely not their story when you get right down to it. Okay. Racial minorities, blacks, Chicanos, and the New Deal. Black people favored Roosevelt and the New Deal, not because of civil rights reforms, but because of New Deal relief measures. Roosevelt gave no support to anti-lynching or any other civil rights legislation. There were a few symbolic gestures, occasional black government appointees, but no substance. But black people were hit the worst by the Great Depression, and with Chicanos not far behind. So the relief payments of 1933, 1934, and the subsequent job programs benefited black people tremendously, despite racial discrimination. In the WPA, virtually all programs of the New Deal explicitly discriminated against blacks, with black workers receiving lower wages than white workers, deliberately paid for the same job. Both the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act at Southern congressional assistance exempted farm workers and domestic servants. This meant excluding a huge numbers of black and Latino workers, and especially women workers. And this is a particular blow against Chicano and Filipino farm workers in California who are being deported. Deportation, by the way, the very term illegal alien, in the 19th century, that term, there was no such thing as an illegal alien. It was simply a question of whether someone here was a citizen or not. The idea of deportation of those who are not citizen is essentially a 20th century idea, which is against American tradition. In the 19th century, there are 7 states in which you did not have to be a citizen to vote. Okay, so this is so the first large-scale deportations of illegal aliens was in the Palmer raids after World War I, where communists and anarchists and other radicals were sent back to Russia, whether they'd come from Russia in the first place or not. But the first large-scale deportations on a non-political basis were during the 1930s and were essentially endorsed by the FDR administration, particularly targeting Latinos, Mexican Americans, who were being sent back to Mexico, whether or not they had American citizenship. Because when the raiders picked Latinos up, if they could not produce citizenship papers, they would be put in a bus and sent back to Mexico in large numbers. This was being done by the Republican state government, but certainly with no objections from the federal administration. Same stuff was going on in Texas, I do believe, although I'm less familiar with that. Okay, so basically, the 1933 cotton strike in California that I've been talking about led to big wage gains for California farm workers under a settlement negotiated by federal mediators, but did not result in the recognition of their union, which was destroyed by government repression at the state level not long afterwards. which the federal government was fine with. New Deal sympathy for unionism did not extend to farm worker unions, especially if led by communists. Farmers, whether big or small, do not appreciate the unionization of their farmhands. In the 1930s, farmers were still 20% of the American population and were much more important for New Deal politics than farm workers. However, in the aftermath of the defeat and smashing of the communist-led farm workers union, there were serious government welfare measures for farm workers, many of whom in California were now white Okies, not Latino or Filipino immigrants. The farm labor camps set up under government auspices for their benefit, perhaps the most radical of all New Deal measures, including free health insurance, so on and so forth, are portrayed very nicely in Grapes of Wrath. And for those who've seen the movie, the man who runs the camp in the movie looks suspiciously like FDR himself. This program, these radical farm labor programs were administered by the Department of Agriculture by a man named Henry Wallace, of whom many of you have heard. Henry Wallace was a Republican who was brought into the FDR administration as an act of, bipartisanship. So let's bring in a Republican. So they brought in Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace supervised both the agricultural programs that led to the Okies losing their jobs, and as well as to the radical New Deal programs, which Steinbeck was enthusiastic about, that are so nicely depicted in the movie Grapes of Wrath as well. And later, of course, on this basis, became Roosevelt's vice president, and then lost to a man named Harry Truman. But that's a story for another time.
Maybe at this time, John, let me remind you that we've gone over the 1 hour. Yeah. So if you want to
I'm almost done. The absolute last thing I want to say, just a few words about the New Deal and women. This was the first administration with influential women in high places. Eleanor Roosevelt herself was the role model, playing the role of FDR's liberal conscience. But here too, actual New Deal members often excluded women under a lot of pressure during the Great Depression for giving up their jobs to men. It was thought the housewife should stay home and raise the children to help solve the unemployment problem, and unmarried women should concentrate on getting a husband. Domestic servants, despite being a large part of the Black workforce, were overwhelmingly women, and they too were excluded from New Deal legislation. WPA wage scales for women as well as for Black people were lowered, and that finishes my story of the 1930s. And we can stop screen sharing and have some discussion.
All right, thank you. Now I'll call on Richard Fullenbaum to talk a little bit about the funds before we go on to question answer and discussion and debate over what we've heard, or even extending the subject a bit. So Richard, are you there? Would you like to come on board to ask people on our funds?
Thank you. Yes. As you know, we continue to collect funds for the Marxist Library, the Nebel Proctor Library, and for our own expenses. Many of you have been quite generous. But
sorry, no, hold on. I have to. Sorry. Okay,
that's okay. I've posted the details on how you can contribute. I was saying, many of you have been quite generous, but we still need money. I posted the details on the chat, how you can contribute either through PayPal or through personal check. And any help you can give would be appreciated. Thank you.
With that, I think what we are going to do is go to the debate and the questions and answers. People who are asking questions.
Announcement. Mehmet Jean usually makes some announcement at this point.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I skipped Jean. Jean, go ahead, please. Go ahead and jump in.
Okay, well, excellent, really good. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And you're coming back at some point. But we have some excellent programs coming up. Next week, we have What's Going On in Myanmar. We're all, ever since the military coup of February 1st, the situation has gone from bad to worse. And we have our comrade and co-founder, KJ No, will join us to discuss the history, politics, and political economy of Myanmar to better understand it. And he's a scholar, educator, and journalist focusing on the geopolitics of Asia and the Pacific. So again, that's next week. And then we have some more things coming up. And if you're interested, you could check our webpage, icssmarks.org, to see not only our past programs, but our future things coming up schedule. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gene. Sorry, I skipped that one. Now, before we go into question and answers, there are some things that we need to consider. People who are asking questions or making a comment, they will be given 2 minutes, around 2 minutes, let's say, and the speaker can respond to those either after hearing several people or after each question. Now, we need to say that the ideas and presentations expressed here, of course, we've said it before, are the the thoughts and expressions of the presenter himself, and does not necessarily reflect on the ICSS or the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. So we need to emphasize that. And going over to now asking questions. Oh, I'm sorry, John, I muted you, so you need to unmute yourself to answer. That'll work better. Let's say it that way. Okay. So I have Alan, Sharon waiting in queue. So let's start with Alan first. Go ahead, Alan, and I'm going to time it.
Okay, thank you, John. Great presentation. I think we need to have more, especially U.S. history presentations at the library. I think it was very valuable. My question is, it relates to the history, but it tries to tie it back to today. In what ways do you see a shift taking place today? You mentioned this in your presentation, back to New Deal liberalism. Is that happening? I guess it's especially among the Democratic Party in power right now. Is that happening? If so, why, how? If not, why, how?
Actually, I think the reason for that is quite simple, because we now have an artificially created Great Depression due to the coronavirus catastrophe. So naturally, there is a shift back to Keynesianism and New Deal policies, initiated not by Biden, but actually by Donald Trump. In the Trump stimulus that was passed in June had some definite New Deal-ish components to it, although with a heavy corporate slant. And Biden has simply done a larger version of that with less money going to corporations and more money going to workers, but ultimately the same concept. I would say another reason for it is precisely because this is such an artificial Great Depression that one presumes that once the corona catastrophe is over and everyone is vaccinated, then America goes right back to where it was economically previously, which means that huge amounts of borrowing against the future, which could not really have been done as well after 2008. The US government almost went bankrupt in 2009, are possible because the economy logically should be vastly more in better shape after everyone is vaccinated. But we shall see. I think it's the economic basis for it. As for the political basis, it's simply because the Democrats and the Republicans, for that matter, though in different ways, are trying to appeal to the American population and are rather fearsome, may I say, of social explosions. And we did have a social explosion this summer through Black Lives Matter. It was an explosion against racist police brutality, as opposed, and maybe the reason it was an explosion against racist police brutality, instead of a general explosion against what the American capitalist class is doing to the American people, may have been because of the Trump stimulus. If people had not gotten those $1,200 checks in the mail, then maybe everybody would have been out on the streets. Anyway, that's my thoughts for the morning. And I'm done.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I was muted. So I have on the stack Sharon, Raj, Mark, and then Elazar. So go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you very much, John. This is very, very helpful in reminding us of history and sharing things that maybe we hadn't known. So thank you very much. I just have a couple of comments. First of all, I agree with you about what's going on, representing the New Deal thinking of the Democrats. But I just want to add that I think it's what the U.S. Capitol wants right now. They've decided that they better buy off some of us working people. The other thing I just want to share is I lived in Detroit from 1980 to 1983, and there's an enormous memory there of the 1930s, at least there was back in the 80s. And I had some elderly neighbors who filled me in on stuff that had happened. And one thing I did was I went on a tour of the River Rouge plant, which is on the southern border of Detroit and Dearborn. And it was conducted by an elderly Black worker who, when we were walking around, and he was talking about a demonstration there, a strike led by UAW, where people were killed, and he knelt down in a certain place and started to weep and said, "This is where my comrade died in my arms." And so I think that the UAW was very successful early on in bridging the gap between Black and white workers, to the great chagrin of Henry Ford, who, among other things, created the town of Inkster, where he had his Black workers living. That was his idea of a joke. And somehow the UAW was able to overcome that, and which is why they were able to have those sit-down strikes.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing, I put up the links for that for that two-part Flintstone sit-down strike video, which in total is only half an hour, and it really backs up everything you've been saying. It's a brilliant video, which really explains the whole thing very, very well, and brings all those links together. And I doubt we'll have time to show the video. If we do, that would be wonderful. But I urge everyone here to download those links and watch it for themselves.
Thank you very much, Sharon and John. Now we are going to Raj. You have the floor.
Yeah, John, thank you very much. Very informative for me, very educational, because I'm weak in American labor history, although I've been getting some information for a number of years, so not as bad as I used to be, but it's very, very useful. And thank you very much for that information and analysis. I noted that you called Hitler, Stalin, and Roosevelt all as dictators of sorts. And so to me, that was kind of curious because they're quite different. And I'm sure you also think they're different, but your focus was different. So I understand if you care to explain that. The other thing that is really substantial that I want you to address is this. Implied in your criticism of the Communist Party of USA in support of the Soviet Union during the war was that if American workers had instead chosen to, and this started before because the deal was made with Roosevelt before the Second World War, that somehow a revolution would have been possible. Now, I don't know, I haven't studied that matter. I just don't know if that is possible. But I do know one thing, that in the Soviet Union, they welcomed the support of the Communist Party in support of the United States helping, in the war effort against Nazi Germany when it actually started. But even before that, their analysis was, while the Communist Party in the United States was not strong enough to make a revolution, it was strong enough to stay the hand of the capitalist class in joining with Hitler. And that, I think, is probably what Communist Party, and there are people who are from the Communist Party who can correct me, that is what the strategy they took to hold back the hand of the aggressor which could have joined actually at that point, was not out of the question on the side of Hitler. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that, if you care to share that. Thank you.
Well, I don't really want to get into Soviet history here, although oddly enough, my PhD is in Russian Soviet history. My minor is in American history. So I have a lot of things to say about that. And in fact, I'm trying to get a book published about the story of Noah London, who was the founder of the American Communist Party, who a prominent leader of his Jewish Federation, who in the 1920s went to the Soviet Union and was sort of a secret dissident and was shot in 1937. But that's a whole different story and a different lecture. But what I will say is, firstly, about dictatorship, what has to be understood is that in the extreme crisis of the early 1930s, dictatorship was in the air and was a popular idea. One example of that is the American Socialist Party, which had a convention in the 1930s in which it adopted a program including the words proletarian dictatorship as what the Socialist Party was for, which would probably sound a little strange to your average member of the DSA these days. But the idea that democracy was better than dictatorship was something that a lot of people were not clear on at the height of the Great Depression. So yes, of course, Mussolini, FDR, Stalin, and Roosevelt represented very, very different social forces. But the fact that they were all using dictatorial methods to go around the rules of democracy and allegedly, in the views of their supporters, trying to do something for the people, was seen as a certain commonality at that time. Now, as for the Soviet Union during World War II, that's a very long and complex story. I will just express my own opinion, which is that essentially that the policies of Stalin did much to weaken the Soviet Union, as in the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and prepared the ground for the near conquest of relying on alliances with France and England, and then briefly an alliance with Germany to fend off the invasion of the Soviet Union, as opposed to supporting the revolutionary forces of the world, was, well, I guess one word to describe that as a blunder, but there are other words can describe that. And I think that's about as much as I want to say in a discussion like this one.
Okay, thank you for that. So now we're going to Mark Alverson.
Yeah, John, I want to ask you a question about the NRA, National Recovery Act, which, you know, I'm sure you know that when that was implemented, many white employers were firing their black employees, and the blacks began to call it the Negro Removal Act for a while. But the question I have is, did you get into the Swope plan at all of 1930 by Gerard Swope from GE as a follower of the NRA?
There was a whole lot of stuff like that going on. There's a Townsend Act and so on and so forth.
Right.
There were a lot of other alternative plans going on. I vaguely heard of the Swopes plan, but most of all, I can say it's not one that went over.
Well, Gerard Swope wound up as one of the decision makers for the NRA.
Yeah, so I suppose you could say that it did. But the main thing about the NRA is what a total failure it was.
Right, exactly. But I mean, but when Swope came out with the Swope plan, and they pitched it to Herbert Hoover, Hoover said it smelled like warmed over fascism to me.
Yeah, well, Hoover was not a progressive Republican, despite some people claiming that he was. He was a conservative Republican. And so he didn't like the progressive Republican people like Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for those remarks. Okay, I have on the stack Eleazar and then Richard W. So Eleazar, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. First, a little comment, and a question, and then a little comment. Gus Hall was in Minneapolis during the period that the Trotskyists led the Teamsters Rebellion, and he disputes and demeans the role of the Trotskyists. I'd like you to comment on that if you can. Number two, you mentioned the bonus marchers, and actually they called on the Marines to first drive the First World War veteran heroes off Capitol Hill, and they turned it down, said these are our heroes. So MacArthur and Patton put together a highly repressive force, and Eisenhower was the subaltern of MacArthur. He filed a confidential criticism of the unmitigated brutality of MacArthur. And I wanted to just mention a vignette that Patton used tanks in this operation, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I am. And one of the people severely injured had saved Patton's racist little life in World War I. So that's all. Thank you.
Yes. Your remarks are appreciated. Thanks for filling out some of the details.
May I add one more point? The thing about Roosevelt, Stalin, Hitler, Roosevelt was called, if you read Rajani Palm Dutt's very fine book in certain ways, Fascism and Social Revolution, literally calling the Roosevelt administration fascist. That switched. I think, John, your point, Holmes, was that it switched when they flipped over to this People's Anti-Fascist Front, where they supported and literally formed a coalition with the Roosevelt administration. And if you read the Communist Party's apology for July 4th about kicking the Japanese out of the party, they cite the patriotic duty of fighting fascism together with Roosevelt. Thank you.
Yes, I believe even the main communist leader of work among Japanese Americans ended up in the camps. What was his name? You probably remember his name. Yes, well put.
Okay, so then now we have Richard. Richard, please go ahead. Richard W.
Yeah, thank you. It was a nice presentation. Thank you. The question or comment that I had is that you sort of implied that that Roosevelt was a Keynesian, and a lot of people, I think, these days think he was a Keynesian. In point of fact, I don't think he really was. I mean, Keynes advocated stimulating the economy in the case of a downturn through money. And by and large, Roosevelt proposed regulations. And I think you brought that out at some point. And it rears its ugly head, if you will, these days by virtue of the Fed now having pumped tons of cash into the financial system in order to prevent a collapse. So I'm just wondering, Keynes didn't even become popular until Bretton Woods, which was something like 1944, 1945. So could you comment a little bit on why people think that Roosevelt was a Keynesian and how that sort of has developed historically? Thank you.
Well, basically, Roosevelt wasn't a Keynesian. He didn't have an ism. He was a politician. He was a very pragmatic politician who believed in doing what worked. A good number of his advisors were, in fact, Keynesian, and explicitly stated they suggested policies related to Keynes's. And basically, the whole put people to work policies were very Keynes, were in a sense very Keynesian, but they were better than Keynes's, because according to Keynes, if you're a literal Keynesian, Keynes at one point supported that one way of priming the economy would be having people dig holes in the ground, put money in the holes, bury it, and then uncover it and then take it out, right? So that's 100% Keynesianism. The Roosevelt administration version of Keynesian was more useful than that.
Or spend money on the military.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Which I think you brought
the policies in the 30s were definitely the WPA. I mean, you had 1/4 of the American population working for government programs. That was pump priming, and in some ways a better form of pump priming than some of what Keynes advocated. And definitely, several of his advisors explicitly said we're listening to Keynes. That's historical fact. So.
Great. Well, thank you for that reply. Anybody else that wants to raise a question? Oh, I think I'm going to give priority to those people who have not spoken yet. I do see some hands up from the people who have spoken. If there are nobody that wants to ask question for the first time. Jean, I think you're trying to say something. Please unmute. Oh, Dev wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Dev.
Yeah,
You have to unmute yourself.
if I could just say one thing here,
Sure.
People should not be limited to asking questions. If you want to make comments and we can have a thorough discussion, that's great.
Exactly. Yeah. Dev, you need to unmute yourself if you are going to be talking, or yeah, go ahead.
No, I by mistake. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries, no worries. Okay, so then I'm going to
Hey, Jane still has his hand up.
Oh, I did not see your hand. I didn't see it. That's why. So I have Jean and Mark on the stack. So first, Mark, let's go with you, and then we'll go to Jean.
My point is really quick. Elazar brought up before about the Marine Corps not favoring cracking down on the bonus soldiers. Part of that was because of Smedley Darlington Butler, who was one of 19 Americans to be accorded the Medal of Honor twice. And he lived to collect both of them. And he'll also go down in history as the man who blew the whistle on the American Putsch in 1933-34 and turned them all into the McCormick-Dickstein Committee of 1934. And of course, that investigation will be toned down and no one's going to go to jail, just like no one went to jail in 2008.
If I could just say a word about that. Yeah, the whole Smedley Butler affair and the question of whether there was or was not a putsch is one of the great undiscussed questions among historians. I think it is really undecided whether the putsch thing was for real or not. But one thing is the historians, even excellent historians like Eric Foner, want to stay away from that one because it's a little bit scary. I personally am uncertain as to whether the putsch was for real or not. But one thing is unquestionable is that discussion of it has been suppressed.
Well, John, I have 113 pages of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, and I've read some of the testimony, and it's riveting. It really is how Butler was supposedly going to be bought off, and he wound up and turning them all in.
Yes.
And the DuPonts were involved, the Pitcairns were involved, Remington Arms was involved. Interesting who was involved in this. Yet it's nothing's going to happen to them. Even the White House urged that this be toned down. Why? Because we're in a depression. We got to put the country back together, and we can't have recriminations such as this. So they glossed it over.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that the historians have refused to talk about that one.
Yeah, well, I went to the New York, one more point. I went to the New York Times, and you can check their archives. You won't find any more references to it in their archives. They're been wiped out.
Yeah.
They're not there anymore.
Yeah. I'm a historian, so I want to be cautious. I haven't seen the proof, but one thing I do know is that you're absolutely correct. Discussion of this whole matter has been pretty much suppressed. Yes.
Okay. So now we are going to Jean. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And excellent talk. A lot of good questions and answers. I do want to say that I'm a retired member of the California Faculty Association and still have my dues deducted from my retirement check. So I wanted to point that out. Also wanted to say when I retired, my union rep gave me this plaque that has a picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the saying, if I were a worker, the first thing I would do would be to join a union. So I just want to add that in there. Also, the name Delano comes from Franklin's grandfather who made his money in the opium trade in China. So, but they didn't like to talk too much about that. But that's another feature there. And the other, my question or comment is, in the Communist Manifesto, my Bible, there is a statement that talks about how workers are going to organize and become the ruling class. But then it says at a certain point in the class struggle, members of the ruling class, the most enlightened members of the ruling class, will desert their class and join the class that has the future in its hands. And that's what happened with the large members of the French nobility during the French Revolution. So I don't know if this is applicable. Maybe you could comment on if you think this is relevant with reference to FDR.
Well, just about that comment in the Communist Manifesto, I think you may have read it a bit. He was talking about the intellectuals, not the ruling class. And he was referring to himself and Engels as members of the bourgeois intellectuals who would join the workers' movement. And he was definitely talking about himself.
I will recheck that. Thank you.
And yeah, I mean, certainly, if you have a full-blown revolution, then some people from the old ruling classes are going to see the light. I mean, it even happened in the Russian Revolution. You had, there was a major Russian capitalist named Savvar Morozov, who was guilt-stricken and didn't like what he did, and provided a lot of the funding for the Bolshevik Party in the period leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. So yeah, sure. I mean, I would say there's only one group in society who you can be absolutely certain will never, ever, and under any circumstance, come over to the revolution. Less likely to come over to the revolution than capitalists themselves, and that's the police.
Interesting. Let me interject myself here, and then I have on the stack Alan and then Raj. Just a point to the police not coming over. The reason why we are in the United States escaping from the fascist coup in Turkey is actually the revolutionary police. Yes, it's very interesting that in this what we call the civil war in Turkey in the 1970s, late 70s, the whole society breaks down and you have to choose a side. Which side are you on? And a police union emerged as the revolutionary police that did not want to fight the people, did not want to be the police of the capital, as they said it. And they were, like before the police raids to some places, you would see a couple of police from that organization just showing up there to drink tea or coffee and then leave. And people would know that that night there was going to be a raid. So people would take, measures and everything. And the passports were given by the police at that time in 1970s, 80s. So when we went to get our passport, it was only through the help of those revolutionary police that we were able to get the passport. So when the society breaks down, there could be some, policemen that change sides because they want to be the police of the people. This is from their slogans. I just want to interject that. Thanks for the comment, though. So I'm going to go to Alan now, and then Raj is waiting, and then Elazar again.
Hey, John. I'm ignorant of the history of the New Deal, and you'd mentioned in passing the NRA and that it was a failure. Can you comment a little bit more about what the NRA was about in the early part of the New Deal?
Well, sure. The initial stand for National Recovery Act. And the basic idea is in each separate industry, you would have a three-part commission, representatives of business, representatives of the public, whatever that means, and representatives of labor, to set codes for the industry, which would determine essentially what prices goods will be sold for. Okay, and which would limit production, so it would prevent overproduction by limiting production down to levels that would not result in overproduction. So, and like I said, what we have left of that now is the agricultural legislation under which farmers get subsidies for growing unhealthy stuff as opposed to healthy stuff, leading to obesity and diabetes. And basically, this idea, essentially, sort of a planned economy from the top, but on a completely free market capitalist basis. And it really didn't work. It worked badly. It worked very badly and became very unpopular and had to be discarded after, and the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like some of the things that happened in Germany with the rise of the Nazi Party, really.
Well, it is formally similar to what was being done by Mussolini and Hitler in their economies, which were more successful for the simple reason because they had economically, because they had more control over private businesses than the Roosevelt administration had.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to Raj, and then Elazar is waiting in queue.
I have three quick comments, and of course, John, please comment on any of them or all of them. First one is on Jean's comment about trade unions, and I also see a great deal of emphasis among followers of Trotsky on trade unions. And trade unions are important for working people, and they should be supported by communists and people, progressive people, because that's a place where they bargain with the capitalist class on the distribution and how much share they get of the product they produce, the workers produce. So that they're important, they should be supported. But they can very easily be co-opted within the capitalist system. They're not revolutionary by themselves. There could be, some of them would go towards revolution, but that is not a trade union thing. And that's the very important thing. If you read Lenin's What is to be Done, comes through. So that's the first comment. The second is about, I disagree with John, with due respect, about comparing the three different, what you call dictators. And fair to you, you didn't say they're the same. I think the building of economy in Soviet Union was completely different. And the building of economy was a socialist economy. It started in 28, got completed by 40. And that is what provided the strength. Rather than weaken, making a deal with Hitler, non-aggression pact, was simply to buy time, because after all, Soviet Union came from a much more backward situation in terms of industrial development. And so that extra time for them was crucial. And they made much more progress than Germany could make in the same time. Germany was much more advanced. So I think it was a good start. The third point, quickly, is about, I saw a movie 7 Days in May, and I think there was about that medley, that attempt. And I would want you to comment about that if you've seen the movie 7 Days in May, or how it was a glamorized version of what happened, and whether or not the movie actually reflected the attempted coup in the United States. Those are the three comments.
Okay. Well, you raise a lot of interesting questions, and I'm going to try and answer them briefly and remind me if I've forgotten one of them. So I'll start backwards from 7 Days in May, which was based on Bobby Kennedy's book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And actually,
no, it's not. It's not about.
Are we talking about two different?
No, 7 Days in May is it's about attempt to overthrow the U.S. government in military attempt, using the military to overthrow the U.S. government. I think it is about 1930s.
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that book, so I can't comment.
Yeah,
I assume this is about the Smedley Butler affair.
Actually, a movie, you may want to watch it. Others might want to.
But yeah, I thought you were talking about, I believe 7 Days in May is also the title of Bobby Kennedy's book about the missile crisis, which is a different matter. But in any case, so moving backwards yes, I should emphasize that there's politics and there's economics and there's society, and they are different things. There's a formal political similarity between the methods of rule of Stalin in the Soviet Union and the methods of rule of Hitler, Mussolini, in Germany and Italy, but the political, we have someone to let in, we should let her in.
Yeah.
Yes, and the methods of rule, which some people use the word totalitarianism to describe, well, that has been greatly misused. Totalitarianism was actually a term first used by Benito Mussolini to describe what he wanted the Italian government to be. And now you have historians who are even saying that Italy was under Mussolini was not totalitarian, which is almost a ridiculous idea in and of itself because he invented the idea. But the social content of the Soviet regime was completely different and indeed opposite to that of Nazi Germany and Hitler. And indeed, the scientific term that I would use to describe the Soviet Union was as a bureaucratically degenerated worker state. And the basic problem with Soviet policy in the 1930s, which led to the Great Famine and other problems, was that Stalin believed that it was possible to build socialism in one country, which, as Marx clearly explained, is not possible. And in attempting to do the impossible, millions of people died. However, despite the death of millions of people, socialist construction in the Soviet Union was sufficiently successful that, in fact, the Soviet Union was able to beat Hitler in World War II. So I would call the Soviet Union a contradictory phenomenon, which needed to be supported against all forms of capitalism, but had huge problems of its own. And that definitely brings us to a discussion way outside the confines of this. And when my book comes out on the story of Noah London, it's in many ways a book about the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union and communism worldwide.
Just wanted to say quickly that it was Lenin who said we're going to proceed to build socialism, and he repeated that in the last 3 essays, yes. One of them, Our Revolution. So yes. Stalin carried the project forward. And secondly, Stalin didn't say socialism in one country. That's a distortion. Sorry about that.
Well, I don't want to get into a great debate about that, but I will say that when Lenin said that, that was an imperative. Yes, of course you want to build socialism in the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean you're going to succeed without an international revolution first. And Lenin was always very clear about that what you needed in a country as economically and socially backward as the Soviet Union or China to actually attain socialism, you would have to have a worldwide revolution. And in fact, the Soviet Union never did attain socialism. And as we know, collapsed.
Well, different approaches.
There's a big debate on this anyway.
Yeah,
yes. Which takes us very far outside of today's discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are going to Elazar now, and then I have Mark waiting online.
Just a brief comment in terms of characterizing Stalin. I think it's a grave error to call him a dictator in the same way that Hitler was. And Trotsky
in a different way. In a different way.
I know Trotsky also, as John mentioned, contrasted the different social base and dynamics of the movements. But here's what I wanted to ask about and talk about was let's say like in Flint, and most of the CIO was organized by the Communist Party. Then the Trotskyists and what was that guy's name, that pacifist, Musty. But rank and file Communist Party members didn't just build the CIO, they risked their lives or their futures or their families. It was not a simple, easy thing to do. And how the transition from that to tying the very unions that they risked life and limb to build to the Roosevelt administration, negotiating, capitulating in many ways to the capitalist class through arbitration. I'd like to know a little more how that transition took place. And a memo of this was in 1939, the Nazis under Fritz Kuhn organized a massive meeting at Madison Square Garden. And the Trotskyists called for a resistance and counter demonstration. And unfortunately, the leadership of the Communist Party and almost everything else opposed this. However, when what ended up being 100,000 people ended up there, 50,000 organized by the SWP, and another 50,000 sympathetically joining in, hundreds and hundreds of rank and file members of the CPUSA were there and violated their party's order not to go. And this is very important to know. These are the kind of guys who built the CIO, and these were the kind of guys shoved to the sideline by the wartime no strike pledges, while the no strike pledges were going on the labor movement, the bosses were profiteering, price gouging, and trading with the Nazis all the way through the war, even after the declaration of war. Read, I always forget his name, Trading with the Enemy. I always forget his name. I had it on my computer. Even I recommend you look it up, Trading with the Enemy. There are many books on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, just two things. Firstly, when earlier I attempted to put up the links for the Indubious Battle trailer and for the Flint video, I accidentally sent it to only one person instead of everyone. Well, I fixed that, and people who want to get the links for the trailer and the links for the Flint sit-down movies, you can now get it from the chat, which you could not before. And now it's a funny thing because my book, my biography of Noah London, isn't just a history of the Soviet Communist Party in the 1930s, although it is that. It is also a history of the American Communist Party in the 1920s. And I even argue in the book that the story of the American Communist Party and the Soviet Communist Party is in many ways not so different. Both of them went bad for essentially, in the last analysis, the same reasons. The main difference being the Soviet Communist Party being larger than the American Communist Party. But in other ways, not so different. Okay. And yes, what happened to the American Communist Party is, first of all, practically all of its original leaders were driven out during the 1920s, including even the Jewish Federation, my great uncle Noah, and replaced by a bureaucrat named Browder, who beforehand had not been a major leader and was distinguished by his subservience to Stalin. And then during the early 1930s, the false policy, there was heroic things being done by the American Communist Party in the early 1930s, notably the farm workers struggle, some of the unemployment marches, many heroic things, but the policies of the Communist Party, a typical example of them being labeling Roosevelt a fascist, which he was not, isolated and alienated the Communist Party from the American people. So when the line was changed to the Popular Front, and all of a sudden the party started recruiting hand over fist and became influential, a lot of the rank and file members said, not just because the Soviets said so, but because it seemed to be working for them. So this was popular with American communists, but that did not mean that they had lost all interest in revolution. And the Madison Square Garden story you told is a good example of that. By the way, I'll mention, and this is an obscure thing, but in 1940, Trotsky, who was still alive, urged the American Trotskyists to vote for the Communist Party candidate in the 1940 elections, despite the Hitler-Stalin Pact, recognizing exactly what you're talking about, that because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, that allowed many American communists, some, the more liberal, were leaving, but some of the more hardened, radical members of the American Communist Party were relieved by the end of the Popular Front and glad to act like revolutionaries again. And so Trotsky thought the American Trotskyists should put an ear to that and actually vote for Earl Browder for president in the year 1940. Hitler-Stalin Pact or no Hitler-Stalin Pact. Anyway.
We have Mark and Elazar who have spoken already, and Mark was going to go next, but I see a person who has not spoken before. Sandeep is online. So Mark, if you don't mind, I'm gonna let Sandeep talk and then come back to you. Go ahead, Sandeep.
Hey, excellent presentation, John, and I learned a lot, so thank you. I had a question about the impact of the radical movement of the 30s on the working class movement in later decades in US. And so if you could speak to that as to how the consciousness and the rights that the working class created for itself in the 30s, how it affected the struggle in the later decades. And is there a link between 30s and then civil rights movements in the 60s, the women's and civil rights movement in the 60s?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I almost feel like the best way to answer that would be to show the Flint strike video. It had a lot of influence. Attitudes were different in the 1930s than they are now. And did this have something to do with the civil rights movement in breaking out? Well, yes. And in fact, in the very last few minutes of the movie, they talk of the Flint strike. They talk about that. Yes, the mass movements of the 30s created an example for the mass movements of the 50s, which unfortunately took a civil rights rather than a working class character due to political events of the 40s and the 50s, which I don't really have time to get into. But yes, a lot of influence. It's almost the only thing I can say.
Maybe what we can do is after giving the floor to Mark and Elazar, if people want to, we can watch. How long is that Flint movie?
Half hour.
Oh, that's not gonna work, I think. The part that you want to show here, is that a
if we had time, it would be nice, but if we don't have time, I've got the links up in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. So we can get that from the chat then. So, okay, Mark, go ahead, please. And then Elazar is next. No, you don't want Elazar? Okay. Okay, so go ahead, Mark. And then Gene.
Yeah, the book you were alluding to earlier, Raj, The 7 Days in May, followed by the movie with Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, and Frederick March, was inspired by the business plot of 1933-34. Where The 7 Days in May was about a novel about a military takeover of the United States. The business plot was a Wall Street fascist plot. But it was, but the movie the book 7 Days in May was inspired supposedly by what happened in 1933-34. So somebody didn't forget. In fact, there's a book, Raj, written by a Jules Archer, came out in 1967 about the business plot. Jules Archer.
Jules Archer. Okay. Thank you very much. And
you'll probably have to find that at a book fair or Amazon or someplace. You won't find that at Barnes and Noble.
Would you
put that on the chat
in the chat, please?
Sure.
I can actually make one useful comment about that. Yeah. People have heard of Gore Vidal, who was sort of the bad boy of the American ruling class.
Right.
And he was a friend of the Kennedys and hung out in ruling class circles to a very considerable degree in the 1960s. He once remarked that, when sitting around the table with generals, top generals of the United States, one of their favorite topics of table chat over a few drinks was just how easy it would be for them to knock over the American government if they ever felt like it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And now, if Elazar is not going, Eugene, go ahead, please. And then I have Richard W. Waiting in queue.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. And I really appreciate this discussion and this very frank exchange of different views, although I disagree with much of what John has said about Trotsky and Stalin and so forth. I think it's very important to have these points of view expressed here, and I really appreciate this last discussion. And I wanted to add one thing that should be stressed about the difference between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and Dweischer talks about this also, but the Soviet, is their class basis. The Soviet Union defined itself, and this is with Lenin and others, that it was a socialist society governed by a dictatorship with the proletariat and the rural peasantry. And this is a crucial part of their concept, this class aspect to it. And this is in both the 1918 and 1924 Soviet constitutions, but not in, well, it's watered down in 1938 and then disappears completely in the 70s by Khrushchev and others. And I would also note that this is the same formulation that you've seen in the Chinese constitution throughout the Mao period, starting in the Mao period and continuing in the present. Everyone says it is a dictatorship of the whole people led by the working class, which they say is in essence the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I want to stress the class basis of both the Soviet Union and contemporary China. And many people disagree with this, I understand, but I would say we have a different interpretation. But thank you very much, and I don't know if you want to comment on that or not.
Just very briefly, the odd thing is that I actually agree with every word you said. Basically, And at the same time, yes, I believe it is accurate to describe the Stalin regime and the regime of Mao if you use the original meaning of the term as totalitarian. How can these two things be true at the same time? Well, Marxists have a conception called dialectics. And that's really all I need to, want to say on the subject.
Okay, I have Richard W. and then Raj wants to go. If there are no new speakers who have not spoken before, that's the stack I have. So go ahead, Richard, please.
Yeah. In your presentation, you described labor activities basically in California, and you described, you know, in Flint and up north. Could you comment on the regional characteristics of labor of labor activities around that time? Did they differ at all, or? And in part, I'm kind of curious because it seems to me that the trade union has given up on organizing the South, or gave up on organizing the South. That, you know, maybe there's a comeback on part of other than organized labor. So could you just comment on the regional variations of labor activity? Thanks.
Sure, although this does get us slightly out of, during the 1930s, yes, there was labor organizing in the South, and it was being done by the communists, and it was extremely illegal. After World War II, you had what was called Operation Dixie, a serious effort by the CIO to organize the South. It completely failed, and the reason it completely failed was simple. You could tell it right from the title of Operation Dixie. They wanted to try and organize labor unions in the South while ignoring the fact that Black people in the South were subject to racial oppression and segregation and Jim Crow, right? Basically, the organization of the South then, and for that matter now, cannot take place. There's an old saying that labor and the Black liberation movement will rise together or will fall separately. This is true even with the current drive in Bessemer to a considerable degree. This is mostly Black workers who were inspired by many sources. One is the fact that Bessemer is the old steel town, and that before the steel industry was destroyed was the heart of industrial unionism in the South, going back to the 1930s and hammer and hoe. And also directly by the Black Lives Matter marches. So yeah, so I think that almost pretty much answers your question.
Okay, all right, so thanks. We have, right now I have Raj as well. So go ahead, Raj. And then it's been over an hour, it's now 12:30. I'm going to then stop the recording and do an informal discussion where it's not moderated, so people can jump in and talk as they wish. Okay, go ahead, Raj.
I just want to say, actually not a comment, I just want to say I appreciate what you presented today, although I disagree with you on Stalin, but I'm really impressed by you and Elazar and Steve Zeltser here, how active they are in the labor movement, how passionate they are. So I appreciate.
Yes, before we leave, I do wish, I've just put up right now in the chat, I was wanting to do this earlier because I think it's relevant. The video of the May Day march, the longshore shutting down the docks of Oakland on May 1st of last year. And there's the video in which I come in speaking as a member of the executive committee of the Peralta Federation of Teachers at around about the 15-minute mark. And where I think this gives you a lot of information about the contemporary labor movement, and the ILW is still the heart of the California labor movement, as they demonstrated here by shutting down the docks. And I got in a few words of my own.
Thank you. Were you done, Raj, or shall we go?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That was a great discussion.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.